Dissociative process is a form of process relating to a sense of fragmentation of awareness, of there being different parts of a person that are on some level perhaps a little bit separate from each other. Dissociation is strongly associated with trauma. It's often seen as a way for a person to cope with experiences that would otherwise be overwhelming and too distressing to cope with. Carolyn Spring is someone who talks a lot about dissociation and trauma and her own experience of these things as well. And she talks about it in a really nice way. She says that it's not an example of things going wrong. It's an example of the body doing things right, the body protecting the person. And I think that's a really nice way of framing it. If you go through something incredibly distressing, maybe in some circumstances you may feel scared, you may feel anxious, you may feel all kinds of different feelings. Maybe though, if something happens that is incredibly overwhelming, the organism might just decide, no, you're not feeling anything. We're removing you from this situation entirely. And the person might not be able to physically escape or remove themselves from whatever it is that's happening to them. But dissociation essentially involves them psychologically removing themselves from the situation. The thing with dissociation is if you remove yourself from a situation, like I've described, there is still a part of you going through the thing that you're going through. There's your awareness that's separate from it, and there's the part of you that's going through the thing that you're going through, and there's a split there, there's a disconnection between those two parts. And there can be more than two parts, there can be loads of different parts, but that's kind of the nature of dissociation, a splitting of awareness. It's probably worth saying as well that dissociation, at least to some extent, I think is a thing that most people do. Maybe not to the extent that their entire process is dissociated and there's parts that are totally unaware of each other, and we'll talk about what that looks like in a few minutes. But I think it's something that most people do to some extent. For example, when I've spoken to my supervisor, or even when I've gone for therapy as a client, there's been occasions when I've talked about a certain thing that's happened, but I'm very conscious that I'm not going into the emotion of it. It's kind of sealed off and behind a locked door, and I can't seem to access the actual distress or the actual emotion that I am relating to. I'm only able to kind of access it in a really detached way. And I think that's probably because usually when something happens that I find distressing, I can't just break down in the moment. I need to get on and I need to put this stuff to one side. And I suppose on some level that could be seen as an example of dissociation of a sort. There's also been times in my life where I've been through something extremely distressing and I've just felt numb. I've just felt absolutely nothing whatsoever. And I felt numb for longer than I want to the extent where I cannot even start to feel things. I just, where's the feeling gone? I'm just kind of in a glass cage and looking at everything through a screen. Again, I don't think my process is dissociated, and I don't think it's a key identifying feature of how I process information and how I am. But I mention these things as an example of ways in which I think most people dissociate at least sometimes as a way of coping. I suppose whether you call it dissociation or just suppression may well be related to whether or not you can access those feelings later on when you want to. Perhaps dissociation is when you lose contact with it altogether and you need to kind of work hard to try and find it. It's in there, the feelings are in there, and I've felt things on a kind of dull level. And I know that if I go into it, then it could be quite powerful, but I'm struggling to access it. Maybe that's when it becomes dissociation rather than suppression. I don't know. I think beyond a certain point, our words are quite clumsy to describe our inner processes. Dissociation, though, I think is something that a lot of people use as a way of coping. Dissociative process, though, or dissociative disorders, are when people dissociate to the extent that the different parts of themselves become entirely disconnected and almost take on separate personalities. Faced with overwhelming trauma and lacking the more complex ways of coping with experiences available to older children, our clients seem to have stumbled on dissociation as a solution. One client, for example, found that when she stared at dots on the wallpaper, she could separate herself out from the terror and anguish of being raped by her father. Some clients describe experiencing themselves as out of their bodies and watching the events from the ceiling. You can imagine how powerful this is as a coping mechanism, dissociating, separating yourself from the terror and the horror of what's happening to you, and being able to feel calm on one level. Margaret Warner talks about how it can have a reinforcing impact. You know, a kid figures out a way of disconnecting from certain emotions and just sealing them up and putting them in a box away, and they're able to function, they're able to go about their day and do things. And you can understand, I think, how that can become a strongly reinforced way of doing things. It's an easier way of coping than having to confront what's happening. Children almost always divide the dissociated aspects of their experiences into a number of compartments that are separate from each other. This may happen because young children have a number of intense reactions that seem irreconcilable with each other, and they do not yet have the mental capacities to integrate such contradictions. The suggestion here is that it's when someone goes through something traumatic as a young child that they are more likely to end up dissociating and having dissociated process, simply because they're too young to understand it in any other way. They don't have the cognitive capacities, for example, to be able to conceptualize what on earth is going on. So dissociating in this sense can be really useful. It can be seen as a superpower in some ways, the ability to just lock your feelings away and feel detached from them. The problem though, and I suppose this is when people can start struggling, is when those parts that have been left behind start wanting to be heard. And if there's enough of a disconnection, they can be heard and they can be experienced almost as different people, as other beings. I talked about what I'd call my low-level experiences of dissociation as being having feelings behind a locked door or a glass screen or feeling numb. I guess eventually I found a way to access those feelings and integrate them into my awareness. Maybe though, if I'd gone through something that was incredibly overwhelming, so overwhelming that maybe the walls between these different parts of myself were just too thick for me to integrate them back again, well, those other parts of me are likely to still want a voice, and they are likely to find a voice in my awareness. If they are not able to be integrated though, I may well experience these parts of myself as separate beings, separate people. So this could take the form of hearing voices, for example, or it could take the form of these parts of me taking over my awareness, I suppose, for brief periods. And whether it's voices or alters that take over a person's awareness, alters is often the word that's used for this, for these different areas when they do take over someone's awareness. They can often represent certain feelings that have been left behind, that are put to one side. So some parts may be really angry, some may be really ashamed, some may be angry at what's happened, some may be angry at the person for leaving them behind. Some may represent the person at the point in which they went through the trauma. Some may represent the perpetrator, or what the person imagines the perpetrator to be like on some level. And the purpose of working with someone with dissociated process is helping them integrate these different parts of themselves. That might not mean not having them anymore. You know, if you're hearing voices, or if you have what they often call dissociative identity disorder, where you become different alters and different parts of you take over without the awareness of other parts. Integration may mean all the different parts getting on with each other. It'll be a very different experience to hear a voice or hear voices and they all get on and you get on with them, rather than hearing voices that you hate and they all hate you. Those are going to be two very different experiences. And similar with dissociative identity disorder, if you move into these different alters, if the alters get on with each other, or if they're at least dimly aware of each other, or at least there's some kind of dialogue on some level between them, then that's likely to be a lot more helpful, and you're going to be able to function a lot better in your life if there is this integration. But it doesn't necessarily mean that the alters or that the voices go away altogether. That's not necessarily what it's about. As a person-centered therapist anyway, I mean, we're not aiming for specific results. What we're doing is offering them, a person, the space for them to use. Our focus is on offering that space. When it comes to offering that space, then it's about offering the core conditions, I guess, not just to the person in front of you, but more specifically to all the different parts of the person in front of you. Giving a space for all the different parts of a person to come forward and be able to talk on their own terms. Margaret Warner here goes into a bit of detail on the importance of not assuming that a client is talking metaphorically as a figure of speech when they're talking about different parts of themselves. It's a way that a lot of people can talk, but clients may well mean this literally, and it's important to be conscious of that possibility. When clients describe experiences that are odd, disconnected, or divided into parts, I'm likely to let the client know that I've heard them, expressing my understanding in almost the same words that the client used. In doing this, I'm trying to reflect in a way that does not make a prejudgment as to whether particular comments are meant literally or metaphorically. So if a client says, "I feel that I'm only here with my head and like my body is in some other place," I'm likely to say, "So it does feel like your head is here and the rest of your body is somewhere else." Paraphrasing or loose reflection that would work perfectly well under other circumstances is often experienced by clients as an unwillingness or inability to understand. That is, if they're literally talking about different parts of themselves. For example, a therapist might unintentionally miss the parts aspect of the communication by saying, "You're not quite here yet," or "It's hard to get started today." That may be an accurate reflection if the client means what they're saying metaphorically, but if they're literally talking about different parts of themselves, then I suppose you've missed the meaning altogether, and they may well feel quite ignored or not heard, certainly, by that. Margaret Warner also mentions here that the key process of empathy, well developed in the person-centered approach, is crucial to the whole endeavour of distinguishing parts from metaphors, really listening to the person and not assuming that you know what they mean by what they're saying. Margaret Warner in this chapter talks about the importance when working with someone with dissociative process of being explicit about your willingness to offer the core conditions to all the different parts of the person. If a person expresses that they hate this part of themselves, for example, maybe a part of themselves that is telling them that they should hurt themselves, then it can be easy maybe to go into that and disparage or collude with this hatred of this part of themselves. What's likely to happen there, though, is that that part of themselves that is expressing these feelings and saying these things is more likely to go further into the shell, or perhaps even get more extreme. Maybe they only are saying all these quite distressing things because they don't feel heard in the first place. Maybe they're needing to shout and say really extreme things in order to feel heard on any level whatsoever. And actually, being explicit about wanting to offer the core conditions to this part of themselves as well could enable them, that part of themselves, to come to the front and be heard and be empathised with and be accepted. As she says here, "I now try to say something to indicate that the part would be welcomed by me whenever I think that a part may be present in the client's experience." And she says this after talking about empathising with a client who hated this part of themselves, and just empathising with that and realising that actually that increased risk because the person's even more at war with themselves. Whereas if we empathise with perhaps what they're saying, but also offer a space to make clear that we can empathise with the other parts of them, I suppose in some ways this might be a little bit like group therapy, holding this perspective and these feelings, but also holding a space to empathise and accept other parts. If we can do that, then I think we're much more likely to be able to offer a space where a person can begin to open up those lines of dialogue between the different parts of themselves. She also says that the person-centered approach, which fosters a relatively equal person-to-person therapeutic relationship and leaves the primary control over core therapeutic decision-making in clients' hands, is often particularly appreciated by clients who have been abused by previous authority figures in their lives. So the person-centered approach can be really well suited to working with people with dissociative process, because this is a space where, well, the therapist isn't going to step in and make decisions for the person. The person has the freedom, has the space to begin to explore and understand what's going on their own terms. That's especially powerful, when they've gone through traumatic experiences due to somebody having power over them and exploiting that power. Person-centered isn't the only form of therapy that can help someone with dissociative process. I think it's widely regarded that the form of therapy often needs to be relational. It needs to have the relationship between the client and the therapist at the heart of the therapy in order for the client to really feel accepted, and hopefully for all the different parts of the client to really feel accepted and heard as well. Working with clients with dissociative process can be quite complex, and this video is just an introduction to the topic. I'd recommend doing more reading, doing more learning, maybe even going on some training if you want to work with this client group specifically. Carolyn Spring, who I mentioned at the beginning of the video, is a really good first port of call for exploring this stuff in more detail, and I've included links to her stuff at the end of the video.